Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, frequent flyers. Thank you for joining us today in the lounge. Today, my guest is Chris Hare. Did you hear me just try to pronounce your name, your first name and last name together with the word guest? Even as a speaker, sometimes we get a little bit tongue-tied. And today we're here to talk about transforming the stories we tell. Now, Chris helps CEOs write their autobiography and really share from that people-centric place and celebrating effectiveness. Too often we are locked in our own stories of ourselves and our past, and that limits us from being able to get to the next level or perhaps not even acknowledge some of the amazing success that we've already had. Chris, it's such a pleasure to have you here today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this for months.
I know we connected on LinkedIn. We had such similar mindsets, and we also connected over the space guests that we've had and just kind of geeking out in that arena. So I'm really glad that we were able to make this work today because there was a potential we were going to need to pivot, but we're here. I had tech issues, but we made it. So one of the things that I always like to do is start the podcast with a quote. And the quote that I found when creating today's show notes was, transformation is not automatic. It must be learned and it must be led. And so often we have this feeling that, oh, well, it should just happen. Like I'll know what to do in the moment. And so we kind of stumble through life, especially in the early years. But a lot of people also, as they get into management and leadership positions, tend to just think that we arrive and we know what to do. And I'm sure you've found that that's very much not the case in all the CEOs and high-level executives you've worked with. What would you say to that quote?
Well, one, I love it. I think the input for me into that shift or that transformation is stories, what I call atomic stories, which are essentially, it could be a moment, small or large, where something happens where there's this shift, right? So it could be this small moment, but there's this explosive energy that helps us to see the world in a different way, brings delight, brings joy, brings grief and sadness, whatever that is. But it's that energy that can really, really unlock that transformation, right? But absolutely, I think there's a big gulf between people who want to change, right? Most of us, I think, want something different, especially when we're in a painful spot, right? But there's a gulf between that and the ability to make that change. And I think that, or to have that transformation. And I think stories are not the only input, but I think they're a critical input to that.
Absolutely. I mean, humans are meaning-making machines, right? We find meaning in everything. And this is why we how do you say this word? When you put your human traits. Yeah, I always can read it in my brain, but then I try to say it. I always have that happen. But we put our human traits on other non-human beings and have this whole story about why it is. And very often it's just that, it's a story. And so I would even say that the stories are integral to being able to get from point A to point B, or lean into the pivot point, as we were talking about before we went live.
Yeah. And then you think about trying to lead transformation within an organization. I've got all my infinite number of stories that I carry around, and then the narrative that I've shaped those into. You have all of yours, everyone else has all of theirs, and those are all colliding against each other, right? And so there's this idea of oh, if we just come up with this, this one great campaign or this one great idea, everyone will be on board, right? But whether it's an organization or as individuals, there's still parts of us, as an individual even, that's trying to hold us back to the status quo versus push forward.
Right.
So,
and the status quo is safe, right? So very often we want to stay there, and at the same time we want to be in a new place. And so humans are these kind of funny creatures where we desire structure and stability, and yet we crave novelty and new. And so it's finding the possibilities within where those intersect that allows us to actually step forth into that transformation or allow it to occur.
Yeah, I had Herminia Ibarra on my podcast, and I love her work on authenticity. And she talks about a CEO that was an engineer, became a CEO, and one of the board members was saying to her, hey, you have to connect with with your team and you're not. Tell a
Right.
story thing to connect with them emotionally. She's like, no, I would never do that. That's not authentic to who I manipulative, etc. And when Herminia
Right.
worked with her, she said, no, you're being authentic to the version of yourself that got you here. But
Right.
if there's a future that you're trying to create, that's going to be highly uncomfortable for you. So it's not going to feel good.
Mm,
But how do you shift so that that becomes authentic for you, right? Because growth is
mm.
pretty much always uncomfortable, right?
Right. Like the metamorphosis of the butterfly, right? That's going to not be a necessarily comfortable process, but it's leaning into that discomfort. I mean, think about when we go to the gym and we have a goal and we're working towards it. It's hard to run faster than you ran last time or to add even just a 0.25 kilograms to the weight bar. And yet, that's exactly how we are able to get and keep moving forward, right?
Yep, exactly. And I think that's where narratives can come in really handy. Like I love this idea of experimenting with different narratives. I call it this
Mhm.
exercise with my clients. I call it bespoke shoes. Like you can have
This
the
focus.
best pair of shoes in the world that are made just for your feet, but when you try them on, they may not be super comfortable, right? You may have to wear them
Mm,
a while and then they break
yeah.
in over time and you're like, "Oh, these actually fit perfectly," right? But it takes time and discomfort to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great analogy, because, yeah, that needs to mold around your foot, right? And as you take action, as you take more steps, then that process can actually occur, which then leads you to, right, this is ideal. This is
Exactly.
exactly the sweet spot of where I can be. It's a really great analogy. Um, I was listening to an Audible book this morning. I thought I had bought the book, but it was actually the review, and it was called "Quiet: The Power of Introverts and a World That Can't." I think it was "Shut Up," but it's dot 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 right now. I took it off my phone already. Um, our world is designed for extroverts. And for a long time, it was celebrated. All the characteristics of extroverts were celebrated. And we tried to make ourselves be something that we are not. And that's where it feels like draining and inauthentic. And that's not to say that extroverts cannot learn and adapt some of our qualities or vice versa. But it's just very interesting to see, okay, understand it all begins with awareness. What is your natural tendency? What are your natural strengths? And then from there, how can you allow yourself to experiment with a new way of being so that you can get to that next level of leadership, so that you can get to manage this different culture team well, all of those different things, rather than being really rigid in a set of beliefs of like, well, no, this is the way I am, and that's just the way it is.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's helpful. It can often be helpful in situations like that to describe how you behave versus
Mhm.
giving it an identity, right? Because when we
Yes.
say, "Hey, this is my identity," then it's much harder to shift out of this versus, "Hey, this is how I've shown up in the world," and because maybe that shifts over time, or maybe the way you need to show up shifts over time.
Absolutely. That's a great point. They having that I am or this is the way it is a very fixed viewpoint, but bringing that flexibility in, we were all a certain way when we were teenagers. And for the most part, a lot of us have grown into different versions. We've evolved some mindsets and behavior patterns, right? Hopefully. I was laughing because I was telling my partner the other day, I had overheard this group of 20 somethings speaking, right? And they were about to go out on a boat day or something. And just listening to what they were talking about, I was like, was this what I was so concerned about when I was 20? Like, I'm sure I said those things. Like, I remember saying some of these things. Like, you don't know how much of a insert word here that you are being until you like are on a different perspective or on a different plane, and you kind of look at it and you're like, wow, okay, like that's interesting, right? And it's just adopting that curiosity of, well, that's interesting. I think is really helpful because it allows us to play and experiment a little bit more, which helps with that transformation of getting out of something that we used to be, and allowing for something new.
And I think when it's interesting because I think the research, Jonathan Adler, I believe, was on my podcast, writes about this idea of when we start to evaluate our personal narratives as humans and
Mm,
as leaders. And I believe it's kind of more in your 30s is when it kind of
yeah.
starts to happen, right? But I've been
Yeah.
thinking lately about and kind of working on a framework of how do we use stories in a way that's aligned to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So at the bottom, it's
Mm,
I tell stories to get. In the middle, I tell stories to make. And at the top, I tell stories to give, right? And we use them
mm,
that way throughout our lifespan. But I think we evolve higher up as we go, right? So at the beginning, it's
yeah.
how do I tell a story to, you know, get in the room, get the job, get the raise, etc. And then as we go along over time, it's how do I make something, make connections, make something that lasts, etc.
Mhm.
And then eventually give. It's how do I give back? How do I give joy? How do I give knowledge to others and and kind of leave a legacy essentially?
I love that. Yes, and it is evolution, and some of it is, as you mentioned, it's the typical time frame. The way we go through life, the journey. But it can also be something if we are intentionally bringing our awareness to these things sooner, then we can, accelerate this process because it all begins with self awareness. And we definitely have more tools now than we did 50, 60 years ago to be able to do that. And language is a really important part of being uh, the story of and the language of our story is very powerful in how we experience our own narrative, right? Because it's giving us the power to choose. And it doesn't mean that things won't be hard. It doesn't mean that it's going to be uncomfortable or sad or full of joy, but it allows us the opportunity to create a different experience for ourselves.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So the story, I know you ask your clients the way you work with them is what is the story you will create for yourself and your community? What what brought you so into this storytelling narrative and why did you choose to help, how why did you become or how did you become the CEO's autobiographer?
Yeah, so I started experimenting with that line recently because it's not like I'm writing a book for them, right? But it's really helping them write their own narrative is really the
Mm,
key there, right? And so I'm
yes.
fascinated by this idea of, um, yes, pragmatically, you need to tell your story to earn trust with your board and your employees, et cetera, to build your executive brand. There's so many ways that you need to tell your story to engage with others. But the piece I'm most passionate about is how do you tell your story in a way that transforms you, right? So my background is big tech marketing, Amazon, Microsoft, agency world. And over time, I really um, got frustrated on behalf of my clients of, you build things, but they don't really have an impact. Right.
Mm,
And, and I had also seen the danger and the, I guess, devastation that can come from people who are highly effective leaders who um, harm other people on the path to winning, essentially. And
yeah.
so where I've and then so I started when I started my podcast a couple years back, that was really the catalyst for me is discovering, and I knew what my gift was, but really seeing it evolve really rapidly as my gift is creating a space where people will tell the story that they don't tell anyone else, but
Mhm.
also in a way that unlocks transformation for them. And so last fall, I pivoted to from kind of really focusing on the big tech marketing and the big corporate narratives, focused on transformation, shifting over to working with leaders and helping them figure out their core narrative. And so
Mm,
for me, now going back to some of the really negative experiences that I had within the big corporate world, and it wasn't all negative, but there was a lot that was negative, was I nearly the difficult part of the story. So I nearly took my life in 2015. And a huge part of it was those environments. It wasn't the only part, but it was a huge part of it.
right.
And the thing that took me to that place was a broken narrative
Mm.
And that was the only possible ending for that narrative. And the fuel to create that narrative was stories, because I could tell you and would tell you story after story after story during
Right.
that time we had talked that justified that narrative and justified that end. And so
Mm.
what I ultimately had to do was replace those stories and then rip and replace. I think of it like a cassette tape, because I had this narrative playing in my head. I had to rip it out and
Right.
create a brand new narrative. Right. So that's why I'm
Mm.
passionate about the work. But once I started to see and have clients um, start to have these major unlocks as a part of uncovering their narrative, that was the end of it for me. I was like, I love this. This is what I want to do. And so my mission now is helping leaders get to the finish line and be proud, not just of what they've accomplished, but who they've become, and who they've taken with them, and also how they
Mm.
accomplished it. Right. And so, the people, when I work with them, they may come to me for, you know, executive brand. How do I get on the stage? How do I write the book? What's the conversation I should be having with my next employer, or starting the next, I'm starting the next company or whatever.
Right.
And inevitably what happens is they go through the process of envisioning the future, but also telling their story across their entire lifespan. And then I do 360 interviews across decades with people who know them well. When they have all of these
Amazing.
inputs, they're having these unbelievable transformations, and these shifts in their narratives, to the point where, I had one CEO tell me recently. He said, I used to tell people you were my CEO narrative advisor, so really focused on the business side of things. And he said,
Yeah.
now I tell them you're my personal narrative advisor. And it's been, one, it's a thrill, but two, it's an absolute privilege, where I'm seeing these phenomenal business leaders who, honestly, if you were to rewind a year and tell me that I would be doing some of these exercises in the workshop that might seem more woo woo, with these really
Right.
type A, highly successful leaders, and there's these transformations that are happening, I would have told you were nuts. But it's so cool to see them unlocking, and not just being successful in their business, but also figuring out their own purpose and then manifesting that. It's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's interesting how when we go for a certain type of work or coaching or advisor, we always tend to think, yeah, okay, this is a business related thing, or this is a skill set thing. And inevitably, what happens is, in that awareness that's being built, there's some rewiring that's happening that allows us to now see our story in a different light. And you're very targeted in that area. So that is just really special, because we can truly get locked in our stories. And thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. It's something that a lot of people are struggling with right now. And a lot of them are feeling like that might be the option or an option, and not able to really see what these other options are. And, sometimes all you need to do is literally one step over and pivot, and then look back, or look to the side, or look over your shoulder, and you'll see a new perspective. Right. And so it's really powerful work that you're doing, because I can already see, from my perspective, since we first met, with the things that you've been sharing in your podcast guests, what those transformations are, and it's really cool to witness. So thank you for doing that work, and for helping people to uncover and unlock their own stories, so that they can write even better ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And I just saw Mark, I saw your comments that authenticity is always time lagged. And Mark has just a fascinating story of um, his own, basically, he stuffed who he was as a kid to be accepted. And then
Yeah.
decades later, hit a point in his career where he needed that part of himself that he'd buried. And he had become, as he describes it, had become a narcissist in the process. And
Mhm.
then realized that through analytics that he actually didn't have the impact that he thought he had,
Right. Right.
and that it was actually about others and factors external to the business that he couldn't control. Right. But think
Yep.
about that decades delay, and the same thing, like
Mhm.
for you, the work you're doing right now has been, you've been building this, since you were a kid, right? So I love that.
Yeah.
That comment's awesome, Mark. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mark, for joining in with us live as well. It's true, right? Because when we're kids, we are social creatures. We want to be accepted. It's a very tribal fear to be rejected or to be abandoned, because not that long ago that meant, it would really impact your survival. And this is why, we have people running around having like extreme nervous system responses to an email, right? Because the way that our systems are designed, there's just so much more information that we're taking in these days. And we do the things that we think will allow us to succeed, right? We see someone else succeeding, like, oh, I have to do it that way. Even in that book I was listening to this morning, if an introvert was watching, oh, the extroverts are celebrated, they're getting awards, they're like winning, I need to do those things, but that's not authentic to who they are, right? And there's a lot of benefit to being more slow and digesting information before you make a decision, right? We need the balance of both. We need the whole spectrum and gambit of everything in order to drive innovation and progress and these types of things. But it certainly is, like, I went through the same thing. I look back now, and I think maybe 5-6 years ago, we didn't really, general public wasn't talking about the word narcissism or, some of these other kind of languaging that we have now. But I look back and I'm like, man, I was doing that. Like, I'm not proud
Doing
of
it
it,
before
but
it
yeah,
was cool. No, I was kidding.
yeah, like I must have taken the fast train or something. But yeah, no, I definitely can see some of those behaviors, or like to your point, when we first started, I would win. I would have success, but it came at an expense, an expense of other people, of damaged relationships, of burnout, of all these other things. And so it's really about, you know, getting that into alignment as much as possible and owning up to who you are, and recognizing where maybe some of those survival tactics came into play. And, it's not wrong, it's not right, but this is what it is. So let's make decisions to move forward and have that impact that we crave, and really realize that, we are community creatures. We do really well together, and no one can succeed alone.
If you're comfortable answering, going back to the beginning when you're talking about transformation,
Yeah.
is there a moment or moments that you think of when you think about that switch for you from where you were 5 to 6 years ago to who
Yeah.
you are now?
Yeah. It was this realization. So I used busyness and work. Work was my like coping mechanism, right? And that healed this feeling of like, I'm not enough, so I have to do all these things to prove myself. So coming from lack, right, a very fear-based kind of strategy. And I had gotten married, amazing wedding, had this beautiful flat in Hong Kong, looking both sides of the harbor. All the things on paper, like tick, 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 happy, had the title, the salary, all the things. And I was so lonely,
Hmm.
so stressed out. And just, I started to move, like that pretense was exhausting to keep up. And then I started to feel guilty because everyone else is telling me how awesome my life is. And I'm like, man, I hate it. Like, this sucks. I have to do this for another however many years. Like, no, thank you. And so I became very kind of apathetic and depressed, but not outwardly, just really sad,
Mhm.
and didn't want to do things. And it was in that realization of I married the wrong person, and I used work and travel to hide from the things I didn't want to face. And I didn't even know who I was. That began the whole journey of coming back home to myself and figuring out, like, I remember texting my mom and saying, what did I do as a kid for fun? And she wrote back, read. I was like, I know that. I still read for fun now. And then I was like, what else? And she put read, LOL. So I was like, okay, I'm a bookworm. I get it. Um, but it really, like, I was on that journey, and I'm still on that journey, to figuring out those small things that bring me joy. And like this morning, the Daily Stoic, the message, because there's a new book coming out, and the email that I got basically said, the definition of wealth is working on what you want to work on. And that
Hmm.
wealth is not defined by how much money we have in the bank, but how fulfilled and satisfied we are with the work that we do. And I can tell you 5 to 6 years ago, I had a lot of money in the bank, but I was not satisfied or fulfilled with the work that I was doing. It was a very kind of superficial existence. And, I've had a lot of pivots living up to Sarah the Pivoter and the brand. And it's all been part of my story, my journey. So in accepting like what was there and leaning more into, does this feel good or not feel good? And like listening more to my heart than my head and what I should be doing based on external metrics or factors or things I couldn't control, that helped me navigate into the path that I'm in now and being able to experience the world that I do now in the way that I do.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I would love when you talked about those moments of joy. I know you're on stage a lot. I know you facilitate
Yeah.
and do so many other things. Is there a moment of joy that you can share that's like where you're now, like whether it was on stage or somewhere else, where it just totally lit you up?
Yeah. When I'm on stage and I'm really engaged with the audience and I am in my flow and it's a conversation between me and the entire audience. It's just happening inside the audience's head instead of out loud,
Yeah.
right? And when I can get those responses back and see that I'm truly connecting, that really lights me up. Um but I mean, it's the small things. It's not even necessarily what I'm doing for work that brings like the monetary thing. This morning I had a conversation with a young man and it just kind of transpired naturally. And he, I have this ability like you to create a safe space for people to open up and share things. And he told me as we were like parting ways, he said, "Thank you. It's been a real joy to converse with you this morning.
Hmm.
And like, I hope you have a great day." And that really lit me up. It was like, this is what it's all about. Like
Yeah.
these moments, these small moments. And then coming home and like, my dog getting the zoomies because I walked in the door and, the small quiet moments with my partner. It's like I've started to really lean into those joyful moments rather than the big, endorphin rush of being on stage or like a successful project completed. That's what I used to really live my life on. But that's a very reactionary, my mood was very much based on like, did I get the gold star or not kind of response. And so I'm, living into the keynote name, slow down to speed up, finding moments in those quiet, slower, almost insignificant to the old Sarah. She would have never paid attention to those. And that's where I'm finding the real joy.
That's awesome. Yeah, I have a client who said, she's like, yes, I've worked on the 5 and 10 year plan and the big vision. But she said, now my vision is when I wake up today, like I'm going to enjoy
Mhm.
every moment and I'm going to go for a walk with my kids and I'm going to eat dinner with them and we're going to laugh and I'm going to be their
I love
mom.
that.
And that's my big vision for the day. And that brings me a
Yeah,
lot of joy, which I absolutely love.
amazing. I love that. I have written on the whiteboard next to me, I am determined to have a good time. And it's just, and just having more gratitude for the things that I have in my life. It's really, all we have is this moment. And it's easy to say, it's very hard to practice, right? It's so easy to get caught up in our stories or to like project forward and plan, but just like in business, past results are not an indicator of future success, right?
Yep.
And so our past stories are not the indicator of our future stories. It's not the indicator of what brings us joy. And so it's fun. I would agree with her too, because okay, yes, for a business, you need to have you need to know where you're going, right? Because otherwise any road gets you there and you'll probably waste a lot of time and money, not be very efficient, and probably the business doesn't last very long. But if you were to have asked me 5 years ago if I would be in Austin, Texas, have short hair, have a podcast, and be doing what I'm doing now, I would have also told you were crazy, just like you said from, when you started your podcast. And so it's I've learned to be a lot more open to what's arriving rather than like the rigid, like, no, it must be this because that's what I studied and that's the track I chose and like cannot deviate. That's a very stressful way to live. And I definitely still get sucked into it, but it's a lot more fun and enjoyable, probably for everybody involved, when I allow myself to be in the moment.
Yeah, and that's why I think it can be super helpful. Like, yeah, it's this weird thing. Like when I'm working on a big corporate narrative, you obviously can't come out and tell all your stakeholders like, oh, we're gonna just experiment with these 10 possible
Right.
narratives and then we'll try it out and whatever. Like you have to put a stake in the ground. But I think that's where it can be so powerful for CEOs and other leaders to figure out what their internal narrative is and what the future they want to create is, regardless
Right.
of what business they're in the future or what role they're
Yeah.
in, right? What's the thing that's going to has the power to propel them to the finish line? And like it may shift and it may change, right?
Right.
But that piece that is core to who you are and your identity and how you're wired, it's a lot more kind of grounding and powerful than, these kind of visions of the future that we try to create.
Absolutely. And I mean, we will always have things that come out of nowhere that shift the landscape, shift the environment. Technology obviously is rapidly shifting a lot of things. Social norms, there's so much that goes into that. But as you said, being aware of what you tend towards and what feels good for you, that's going to allow people to also go into positions that feel really good for them, which means they're going to ultimately do better work,
Hmm.
right? Because they can connect to it rather than having to spend all of this energy to be something that they're not. And that's where we get the burnout epidemic as well.
Yeah.
What has been your experience with the stories? I mean, obviously you have had your very personal experience with seeing only one solution and then being able to come out of that. But in terms of like your identity, what shifts have you seen there? Have you noticed that there was a point in which you recognized, okay, I'm not going to try to change myself. I'm accepting like these are the things that I care about that fulfill me, and that's enough. And let me go in this direction. Do you have a defining moment also?
Um, I mean, it's a painful one. So in 2020, I've never been fired, and my wife fired me from being a husband. So we separated. I got kicked out with like 2 days before my birthday. That was amazing.
Mm,
But it was a huge gift. We're back together now, but what it challenged, like what I had to do essentially was go, and that's the point in time where I had to rework the entire narrative about
yeah.
who I was and how I viewed other people. Because essentially, um, my in my story, I was the hero and also the victim,
Yeah.
right? And um, and so had to really shift that, and so worked through that process of rewiring that and rewriting it. And so that was incredibly painful. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but at the same time, it was the greatest gift. I met a guy at the gym last week. He used to be a sheriff, and he was hit by a drunk driver in a Hummer and lost his leg.
Wow.
And he's still navigating the grief process and the recovery process. But one of the things he said, I wouldn't trade this for anything. He said, I was a terrible person and my
Mm,
wife and kids didn't want to be around me. And now,
mm,
like, he had tears in his eyes and now he loves people as a result. Right. So he's like, I wouldn't change that. So
yeah.
same for me. But I think the key for me, and where I've also started to go in my work with my clients, is, and this can there's caveats with this, but I
Of
think
course.
when you get to a certain point, I think there's a ton of power in having other people tell you your story,
Mm,
especially when you're navigating a transformation of some sort, difficulty, whatever. So for example, if you've been laid off your job, probably the last thing you need to do is go out there on social media and tell your story. Actually, because at that point, at that moment, with the difficulty you're going through, it's all about the right inputs, right? So going to people who care about you, love you, support
yeah.
you, have been part of that and seen you over time, having them tell you not only like what you've done and what your successes are, but what your values are, how they've seen your values play out,
Yeah.
how you that you've made them a better person, and then also who they see you and what your identity is, right? Because
Yeah.
that piece, and again, you don't look to people for your identity, but those inputs can be incredibly powerful in recognizing, like, hey, this is who I am. And so much of it,
Yeah.
um Mark, for example, who's I don't know if he's still with us, but who I mentioned before, I asked him one time, like, hey, if you had to tell a CEO why they should work with me, what would you tell them? And just off the cuff, um, he said the single most important skill in the world today is asking questions, and there are a few people better at it than Chris. When you walk in with a problem, Chris asks you a question and you leave thinking he gave you the answer. He didn't. He just asked the right question to help you figure it out yourself, right? I never would have thought
Yeah.
of that in a million years, right?
Right.
Um, or someone else told me once, this old farmer friend of mine, he said, Chris, you're not a storyteller, you're a story discerner. And that kind of riled me up a little bit, like, no, I'm a storyteller. But that's ultimately where my work has gone to is, yes, I tell stories, but also a lot of my work is just asking a question and being quiet and being present, and then
Mm,
discerning the patterns and seeing those, right? But again,
yeah.
to your point of living in community and succeeding in community, I could never have gotten there on my own. I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing right now if it weren't for other people speaking truth at
Mhm.
me.
Yeah, I love that. Speaking, their version of you that they see, it's all of a different perspective because we all live in our own realities, right? We all have these unique experiences. Right now on this podcast, we're having our own unique experiences. And I always like to say thank you for that reflection because what different people, different mirrored surfaces, like being in a fun house, right? There's going to be some mirrored surfaces that make you look bigger or smaller or like wide, or there's five of you. And that's what happens when we can get those reflections from other people. But it's again, be discerning on who you are asking, right? Because not all of those reflections are necessarily useful or valuable or accurate, depending on who you're speaking to. And so it's having the right discernment and nuance when you ask. But certainly those people who have seen you over time, all the different evolutions, versions of you, whatever iteration you're on now, they can then reflect back patterns, and they can reflect back in a really kind and supportive way what they see as how you're showing up. And I think that's really useful because, as you said, sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you can't see those things, and you may certainly not even feel it, but understanding how other people experience you is so powerful.
100%. And I think that, yeah, that is the caveat side, because I would say the first 40 years of my life, I'm almost 48 now, were the wrong people telling me the wrong
Mm,
things that I then believed. Right.
right.
So, and so then it's whatever, for whatever reason, that shift has happened where I think part of it is once I started to do the work internally, and I didn't even know what the work was, right? But once I started to do
Yeah,
that work and then also shift, um, there was a shift that took place that was really outside my control, but a shift that took place with different inputs. And to your point, you
yeah,
still have to weigh those. But when you have those, and not everyone has those around them, but when you can get them, it's a real gift.
absolutely. And this is why it's really important to be intentional about cultivating community and relationship. I mean, in the Western world, and especially in North America, and especially in the US, we have a very individualistic, like hyper individualistic society. And yet, even so, no one person that we see at the top or that we kind of put on a pedestal has gotten there on their own. And it's really, valuable to then be able to lean into your community. So when these moments of transformation arrive, when the pivot points arrive, you have that support network around you, you have the foundation. And you can also have people reflect back like, hey, I think that this is like the road is not going to go well for you if you go here, and you have enough of this community around you and you're getting this common feedback. You're going to go, okay, maybe this is something to consider, right? This is not just somebody being a naysayer, this is, valuable information that I'm getting back. And so it's really important for both ways to be able to have community there to support us.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to dive into atomic storytelling because obviously this just captured my attention as soon as you came up with this phrasing, and I would really love to hear from you. What exactly is atomic storytelling, and how can our listeners begin to utilize this in their own lives?
Yeah, absolutely. So the origin of it started probably about 2010, 2011 when I was working at an ad agency, and then evolved over time. And essentially there's this idea within ad agencies and brand agencies and big corporate environments that the big idea comes from inside. So it comes from
Mm,
the super creative person, the really powerful team, and we all get in a room and we figure out the big answer, right? And what my approach was over time is, especially in working with the business to business audiences that I was marketing to, is I oftentimes didn't know the answer, and
mm.
or didn't even have a clue what I was talking about, right? If it was something really technical. And so I just thought this is what you do. Like, rather than, hey, here's the brief, just read it and execute on it, I would go and create with the audience and then the people who influence them as well. And what I found over time, and then when you see, like, these huge enterprise companies, it's really a supply, like when they're thinking about content, because a lot of my career was spent in content marketing.
Okay.
It's essentially a factory model, right? So we're going to create a supply
Mm,
chain, and it's all about stripping out inefficiency, and it's all about volume and velocity of campaigns and content and messages, right? And you just get
okay.
further and further away from your customer. So that's where it started, is this idea of like, no, it doesn't happen. It doesn't come from within the walls typically, but it comes from going and sitting with your customers and your sellers and your partners and getting them telling their stories, and seeing over and over and over again these small but just explosively powerful moments, that could unlock a narrative, could unlock a campaign, could unlock the content that you're creating. And so that's where it started. And then as I've started working with leaders, it's really around, helping them discover the stories that, atomic storytelling, helping them uncover and tell the stories that make work matter, right? My
Mm.
nerdy physics joke. Um, but but it's really uncovering those moments of, through telling their stories, those moments of delight, joy, discovery, surprise,
Mm,
etc., that have the power to shift things. And so
mm.
it's really messy. So
Okay.
there's plenty of talk. You go on LinkedIn, you search storytelling, everyone's telling you, like, tell more stories, tell better stories,
Yeah.
use the hero's journey, use this, use that. And the reality is life is really messy, and it doesn't necessarily follow those structures. And then you
Yeah.
have also you have people who are kind of more elitist, who are like, oh, very few people are storytellers. Like, that's for the gifted few. And the reality is, almost every single person, with few exceptions, when you go to the bar, you go for a walk with friends, whatever, that's how we live and process meaning
Yeah.
and interact, is telling stories. So it's
Absolutely.
those unfiltered stories that come up out of nowhere that have the power to shift things, right? So, um, I had a client who, I asked, as part of our workshop, and normally the workshop I do in a half day, but because of time zones, we split it 2 weeks apart, 2 2-hour sessions. And I
Okay.
asked him a question of like, hey, can you tell me this kind of story? And he said, I don't have that kind of story. And he was pretty aggressive about it. Like, that story doesn't exist. Right.
Hmm.
And 2 weeks later, he comes to the workshop, and he said, you won't believe what happened. He's like, I wasn't thinking about that work at all. I was just sitting in the sauna, and it was like this lightning bolt out of nowhere. This story from when I was a kid that I completely forgot and just hit me out of nowhere. And then it was
Mm.
just pure unadulterated joy for 15 minutes straight. Right.
Ugh,
And so
love
it's
it.
like, that's the thing you want to tap into. Right.
Yeah.
And so how do you find that? And then that's the
Mm,
thing you can share, that when whether it's going back to the give, make, get framework, that can serve, like, hey, if I'm pitching to you for funding, like, how do I find that story to bring you in and
yeah.
capture, so that I can then share what the solution is, right? Or when I'm trying to go navigate a transformation as a leader, how do I tell that story so that it impacts me, right?
Right.
And makes me a better leader. So yeah.
I love that. And what I'm hearing is that in that moment of stillness, right? Not even and when we let go of the trying of the I need to find this thing or I must do I must fill out the framework for Chris. It just comes in, right? And I think that's true for a lot of things, right? This is why we get our best ideas in the shower, washing dishes, driving. It's when we just allow ourselves to be with ourself and have that stillness that these things can start to crop up. But if we're just constantly on the go, constantly moving, it's really hard to dig and find those nuggets of gold that are already there, right? It's
Yep.
just about allowing yourself the space to find them.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah, love that. So I guess the practical advice and takeaway for people is find more moments of stillness where you're not receiving inputs, right? Not listening to a podcast, not driving is okay, but don't have the radio on, not in conversation, just creating some pockets where you're staring out the window or you're simply just enjoying that cup of coffee or cacao and allowing yourself to like smell the aroma and just be with it. More moments like this will help those stories come through. Would you say that's an accurate assessment and practice?
Absolutely. I mean, I need to do that myself a whole lot more.
Right, I know.
I mean, I find, like, I try when I go to work out late at night, I try to not think about work at all. But what's interesting is you know, when I'm underwater in the pool, that's when the ideas always hit me. So I'm also learning to,
Mm,
you know, not stress out and go and try and find solutions while I'm there. But also, if
yeah,
something hits me in that moment, being open to it, right? But I
yeah.
think there's I love the book The Creative Habit by Twyla Tharp, and she talks about the fact that as creative people, for her it's dance and choreography, but we think, oh, we just want no constraints, right? We just want complete and total
Right.
freedom, and what we actually want is a structured scaffolding that we can go crazy inside of, right, and do amazing things
Mm,
inside of, right? And
yeah.
so where I've over time developed what I think is a good balance within the work that I'm doing is there's a messy process, because the story and we are messy beings, but
Mm,
I should say, the experience can be messy, the process is very linear. But one of the things that can be really helpful, one of the exercises that I do, is having, I call it 5 stories, and it can be more than this, but it's documenting,
okay.
whether you journal it, record a voice memo, whatever you do, but essentially going back over your life and telling stories of moments where you felt joy or pride or peace, but felt proud of what you'd accomplished. So it could be the trombone solo in 6th grade, it could be climbing a mountain, it could be, hey, I traveled to another country and I communicated in their language for the first time, whatever that is.
Mm,
And it has to be, there can't be input from anyone else. So it can't be, my dad said, good job,
right,
sport. It can't be anything like that. So it's just you on
right.
your own, and then documenting those. And then also finding at least one negative where it was kind of the opposite, where it just completely tanked your energy. So the one side it lit you up, and the other side it tanked you, right? So starting
Mm,
to capture those over time, and then starting to ask other people for those inputs about you as well, can really help you to find those stories that you can use to fuel your eventual narrative. But that's I found that to be a really powerful exercise. But absolutely, that stillness piece can't be overrated.
yeah, absolutely. I love that. And good distinction there as well on this was not a the external because you won the award or because you got the gold star or somebody congratulated you, but this was like you did the thing and you just had this intense feeling of something positive or negative, right? I think back to a lot of my athletic moments, and like you're out there on the ice or you're out there on the weight floor, and like you have that experience without knowing if you won or not, or if somebody else was there to give you that feedback. And so diving into those moments is really powerful because often then we can also relive them and start to feel those emotions, which can inspire us to do other things, right? Or maybe go back to a practice or a habit that we used to do that we let trail off or that we forgot about or somehow convinced ourselves wasn't necessary, things like that.
Yeah, I think there's something like when I'm building a corporate narrative, what I often look for is conflict between beliefs and values and
Mm,
what the outcomes are that you're trying to drive. So,
right.
for example, hey, our margins are razor thin. We could increase our margins by cutting corners or going against our values, but our values constrain us, which creates this conflict. So you have to innovate, you have to partner, with a competitor, you have to do whatever to get out of that, right?
Right.
But I think there's also something really fascinating when you're thinking about yourself with how you view yourself, how it actually conflicts with what the reality is about you.
Yeah.
That comes out of
Yeah.
those stories. So, for example, like I had a GM from one of the biggest companies on the planet and did this exercise with them. And when we looked at the board, every single one of the stories were, even though the instructions were clear, every single story had to have at least one other person and had to have an audience and had to have someone saying you are good enough, you are big enough, you are strong enough. From little league soccer, like, hey, you were big enough and strong enough, to up to that current moment of like, hey, I was rated the top speaker globally for the company for this year. But then the
Mm,
last story was when they were in a room by themselves coaching someone one-on-one, and that person had a transformation and an unlock. And so I said, what do you see in the pattern here? And it was stark. They could see it. But then I said, that's the magic. Like, that's what you did for me. You asked me
yeah.
the first day we met, you asked me two questions and they both pissed me off. And but the one question, as it sat with me for the next couple of days, I had this complete unlock and it literally felt like 100 pounds fell off me and I
Mm,
had complete freedom. So I'm like, that's the gift, right? Like that's the thing to
yeah.
push into. But that wasn't, there's no way she would have seen that without telling herself her story.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's like that story is so ingrained just internally that when we say it out loud, we have a different experience of it, and then obviously in your reflection back and in those questions you can ask, all of a sudden we're like, oh, yeah, that is the thing, or that's right, and we get these aha moments. And so that's why it's really powerful to share these things. And I forget who said it, but isolation is the worst advisor. And it truly
Hmm.
is, because you'll just get locked in these loops, right? I always like to say it's like a vinyl record. Once you put the needle down, it can only go in one direction and it can only play the songs in a certain order, right? It takes effort
I love
to
that.
like lift the needle up and then put a new record on there, and also be aware, like most likely whatever it is, the new thing that you're building, we're going to have the same thing happen again. So just being aware of the process, regularly checking in, that's what allows us to be able to maybe upgrade from the vinyl to, what we have now, which is songs can play from any album or, any radio station in any order.
Oh, that's powerful. I love that.
Yeah, I love it. I'm a big vinyl geek, so it's one day I was just kind of looking at it. I like the aspect of, when you've got company and, you're more intentional with like the music you're playing, because it's not just this curated playlist for you. And, you have to go and I remember the first few times I changed the vinyl, like I had to stop conversation. I could not do both things. I had to really focus on that. But eventually I was able to more effortlessly change while I was still doing, something with people around. And,
I'm
so
gonna
it's just being intentional.
I'm gonna grab this piece of art I have to show you really quick. Hold on.
Okay, go get it.
So this is from my favorite record store in Seattle, and it's the Space Needle is the record needle.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so cool.
Playing the
I love it.
final. But yeah, as you were
Yeah.
talking, I'm actually doing the visual identity for atomic storytelling right now, and
Uh-huh.
the thought that came to mind is like, oh, how cool would it be to actually take the visualization of the atomic story, like a circle or whatever, and put it in
Yeah,
different story environments, like a vinyl or whatever. So if you're
I
okay
love
with
it.
that, I might try that. You'll get the credit.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can give me shout
And the
outs. I'm
swag.
totally cool
And
with
the
that.
swag.
Yes, I would love swag. Um, yeah, vinyls are cool. I remember I got one of my best friends in Hong Kong it was a vinyl record that they had done art with. So they had cut some things out and it was like a Star Wars something or other. I was like, man, this is so cool. I kind of want to keep it for myself. But I still gave it as the gift. Well, amazing, Chris. I feel like we could go on forever. I love the work that you're doing. It's super powerful. I have a lot of people that I am already thinking about connecting you to because this is really meaningful work. And I love that you focus on executives who, yes, they've achieved results, but they're looking at that higher level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Um, so definitely going to be sending some people your way. I think you already mentioned it before. However, I would like to know from your perspective, what do you believe your superpower is?
It's creating a space where people want to and trust that they can tell the story that will transform them, and then helping them tell that story.
I love that. Awesome. Okay. Very clear. It's awesome to be clear and like know what our superpowers are because then we can really use them for good and actually use them rather than being like, no, that doesn't fit my story about who I'm supposed to be, right? And so embracing the superpower is a really cool thing. Um, in our lives, we make a lot of decisions, and very often we will check in with people who those decisions might impact, right? Or get those reflections we were talking about earlier. And so we have our own version of a personal board of directors. So I always like to ask my guests, who's on your personal board of directors? Now, this can also be one caveat, doesn't have to actually be people that you know. They can be people that you do actually consult with, or it could be someone like, I love their mindset. I'm going to adopt that as I look at this as a perspective to make my assessment. Or it could even be an avatar, a character from something fictional or somebody from the past.
Hmm. Yeah, there's so many. It's almost like a tribe of advisors.
Yeah,
So
so it's
on
situational is what I'm hearing.
yeah, but on the
Yeah.
business side, there's a number of them, but Whitney Johnson is one. So she came on my podcast, and now we actually coach each other. But
That's cool.
her book is and her focus is on disrupting yourself, and she's been really a
Ooh, I
phenomenal
love that.
advisor for me as I'm making the leap up the S curve to this next level of where I'm at.
Cool.
But yeah, aside from that, like I have so many people that in all different areas, creativity and business and other people, but also
Yeah.
like Twyla Tharp, like that book. I'm always like, I'm always thinking about like, okay, how do I build that scaffolding? At the moment, the
Mm,
scaffolding is like collapsed on the ground or in the back of a truck on the way from the rental place, and need to build more of that scaffolding. But that framework and the way she thinks about creativity and creating luck and things like that is
cool.
she's one of my favorites. So
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. And you just sparked something for me as well. Have you heard of the book The Creative Act: A Way of Being by Rick
mm,
Rubin?
no, oh,
I'll
actually,
send
yes, I have, yeah, have not
It's got
read
a
it, but I've heard.
circle with like a dot in the middle, right? It's I got it last year, at the end of last year, early part of this year, and I think you'd really enjoy it. I'll also share the link for other people watching the podcast in on the platforms as a comment. But that has been a really powerful book to just, again, help with reframing the stories and really getting back into creativity as a way of being rather than something that you do or that you have or you don't have. And so
Yeah.
I thought that was a really powerful book to go through. So as you're rebuilding your scaffolding, maybe this will also assist you.
Yeah, I'll check that out. I've heard his interview about it, but I'll use my Audible credit for that this month.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. All right. Well, my third question is a self-reflection question. And this is uh, asking, how do you best represent or serve humanity from the context of there's been an alien race that has come to Earth and you are the very first human that they get to interact with. So what do they learn about humanity because they have met you?
I think the first thing they'd say is, "Man, everyone must be this funny." No. 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 What I would like to think is that people are different, more joyful, more peaceful, um, and their direction changes,
Mm,
if and when it's needed after they interact with this guy. So they're going this way metaphorically, and after they interact with this guy, they have
they
not
pivot.
only a new direction, but also new people around them to help them get there.
So they pivot.
They do. Absolutely. They stop lounging and they pivot.
I love it. I love
Except for
it.
your
What a
podcast.
great
They will lounge in your podcast, but they stop lounging around other than your podcast. Yes.
right. They'll pivot into the lounge, but then when they're
Exactly.
done lounging, they'll pivot back to whatever it is that's giving them joy these days. So
Exactly.
amazing. All right. Thank you, Chris. This has been such a pleasure. Where can people find you? What's the best place to connect?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn at Hareforce1, Hareforce
That is so
1.
good.
And then on my website is the storied, STORIED future.com. And there it
Amazing.
is
That's up on
magically.
the screen for everyone who's been watching. It's also in the show notes, so you can go ahead and connect with Chris. Also, I'm a big fan of puns. So Hair Force One, that's really good.
I've had
Bravo.
had that one locked down since I think like 1998 on Juno, I think.
Amazing.
So yeah,
That's so good. Yeah, amazing. Well, Chris, it's been such a pleasure. I'm so glad that we were able to connect and make today happen. And I look forward to hearing more of the storied future with your future guests.
absolutely. It's been an amazing pleasure and really enjoyed chatting with you and excited to keep following your journey.
Thank you so much, Chris. For everyone who's watching us, stay tuned for the next episode of The Lounge. Next week on Tuesday, June 11th, we'll have Cherie Mason to join us here for an episode on her career working in the military as well as a speaker. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you soon.